Hildy is a bawdy, chain-smoking, 70-something former journalist who lives on the Upper West Side in an apartment that has a portal back to 1973. Time travel has rules, though, and Hildy breaks them by traveling back with healthcare aide Trista. Now both women will have to come to terms with their pasts before they lose their chance at having a future. From Ahoy Comics comes Alisa Whitney's Guilt. That's Gilt, a comic book that's Sex and the City meets the Golden Girls by way of the Twilight Zone. Call your local comic book store and ask them to order your copy of Guilt today. Welcome to Endless, a Sandman podcast from Chipperish Media. I'm story expert who has risen in hell's hierarchy, Lani Diane Rich.
And I'm writer, erstwhile DC Comics editor, and blood of a bygone decade, Alisa Whitney.
Today on Endless, we are going to be talking about A Hope in Hell and Passengers, issues 4 and 5 from Sandman Volume 1, Preludes and Nocturnes. Both titles were written by Neil Gaiman and illustrated by Sam Keith and Mike Dringenberg.
Through your dreams, my sleeping children, you had a passenger and you never knew. Time to wake up.
All right, everybody, today, a little warning before we begin. Some of the content we are discussing from today's material does deal with suicide, so make your own choices about whether or not this is something that you are ready to listen to. If not, then please come back anytime. We'll be here because it's recorded and it's going to be there forever. Alisa, how you doing today, honey?
I'm exhausted and loopy, so this will be fascinating.
Oh, that makes the best podcast material. It really, really does. It's going to be a lot of fun. All right, so here we are. We're talking about A Hope in Hell and Passengers, issues 4 and 5 of Preludes and Nocturnes. So what we're going to start with is our overall response to both of these issues. How do you like them? What'd you think?
Well, all of these I loved. I loved them the first time when I read them, and I'm loving them now, which is really great because there have been other things which as a younger person I adored, and I look at it now and I think, oh, it feels more remote, which was the style in writing then, or it feels clunkier. None of that. So looking at this, I feel that issues 1 through 3 were concerned with world building and laying the groundwork for this first story arc. Now with issues 4 and 5, we're really declaring a worldview and staking a claim to a really broad range of tones. We may be deep in the land of horror here, but it's horror with a hopeful heart. And there are these wonderful side excursions into old comic stuff. It's also where Sandman began to really find its audience. I unearthed a 2013 interview in The Guardian, which is an English newspaper. Mm-hmm. And Neil was saying that, for the first 8 issues, he just assumed that it was not, he would get a very short, limited run. And every comic he said he liked doing before had been a commercial failure. So issue 1, I think he said, was in October 1988. It had great sales. Mm-hmm. And then issues 2, 3, and 4 saw a downward spiral. And then on issue 5, they started this slow but steady climb upward. And then it became a juggernaut. This can really reassure any of us who are not instantly finding our audiences with a series.
Yeah, sometimes it takes a little time. Sometimes it takes a little while for everybody to find you, And I love that, that it was really starting to kind of like pick up with these issues, because I think these issues are really fun. Like you said, we did all this world building. Now we're kind of getting into this story, right? We've got a protagonist with a goal, right? And they're moving toward it and they're providing the motive force, all of that stuff. It's really, really fun. I generally, like, as I've said, I don't like horror, which is really, really funny because I spent a lot of time like talking about Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which of course is, as I put my finger quotes up, horror, right? It's more comedy and deep emotional stuff, but it's vampires and demons and, violence and all that kind of stuff. And generally, I don't really like horror because I have an overly active empath gland or whatever that is, whatever the source of that is. It's overly active for me. And so when I see people in fear and I see people in pain, I feel it, especially the fear. And as someone who has kind of had to deal with a lot of anxiety, throughout my life, I tend to want to avoid fear. Like I don't dig it, At the same time, I give these kind of the same pass that I give Buffy. Buffy is, a story that I've been talking about for years and years. And I've learned more from, engaging with Buffy more as a writer and a storyteller than I have from probably any other single piece of fiction. And I'm finding I'm getting the same feeling about this. Because in the end, any genre, there are certain hallmarks of particular genres. Sci-fi is basically, technology creating a philosophical question that you can examine. Fantasy, of course, is in the realm of magic and metaphor. Romance has a romantic love story at the center of it. So all of these genres have those things, but stories themselves have, human, and again, even though, of course, Sandman is not human, he is coded as human. We see his experience through a human lens. All monsters and mythological, they're all coded as different kinds of human experiences, representations, distillations of human experience. And there is something about Dream that I connect to the humanity in him, and having him as the anchor that is leading me through this experience, I'm finding myself really enjoying it. It's so narratively dense. It's so interesting. It's so much fun. And I'm really loving it.
I was thinking as you were talking about horror, how at the same time that Sandman was being written, there was also Hellblazer, which is John Constantine's book, and that was written by Jamie Delano. That was a horror book which had a very different feel. It was very political, and it had a more cynical and world-weary feel. You got the feeling that, in the end, things would not go well, which sort of suits John Constantine. And it had more of a satirical heart. There is something, we'll talk a lot more, but there's something hopeful at the heart of all this horror.
Yeah. Yeah, which is really a wonderful kind of mix of flavors to have. So before we get into the big detail, let's go ahead and hit our summaries.
So, A Hope in Hell. It's scavenger hunt time as the King of Dreams pays a visit to Hell to reclaim his lost helm, an archaic word for helmet, from the unknown demon that got it in a trade. Dream discovers that the Bowie-esque Lucifer is no longer in sole charge of his kingdom, which I believe makes Hell a parliamentary system. Dream uses classic fairy tale hero ingenuity as he navigates the tricky business of negotiating with demons. After Dream cleverly uses his pouch of dream sand to determine which of Hell's innumerable demons has his helm, he agrees to battle Choronzon in a Borscht Belt version of the classic transformation battle between two magicians, which you would know about if you'd finished your PhD in comparative mythology. Hope seems to be the theme of this issue, but just as the Sandman trots off, his hopes fulfilled, we get an epilogue that shows us Arkham Asylum's toothless puppy of an occultist, John Dee, getting a deathbed gift from his mother, an eyeball amulet that answers Dee's hopes and dreams.
In Passengers, we open in Arkham Asylum, where John Dee escapes naked and hijacks a woman driving alone at night, telling her she's going to drive him to find his ruby. Meanwhile, Scott Free is having nightmares about his childhood at the JLI embassy when he wakes up to see Dream sitting on his bed. Dream also wants the ruby. In the car, Dee's hostage offers him a coat of her husband's to wear so he doesn't freeze. At the JLI, Scott searches the database and finds very little useful information, so he takes Dream to talk to the last Martian, who tells him that the ruby is in a warehouse in the upstate Gotham town of Mayhew. As John Dee rides with his hostage, Rosemary, they talk. She is kind to him. She asks him about himself. Dee tells her what he did to the ruby, that he transformed it into a solid dream that only he can use. In the headlights, we see the sign for Mayhew. Dream gets there first, but when he touches the ruby, he finds it corrupted and he falls to the ground. Rosemary drops John Dee off at the warehouse. She tells him to keep the coat. He shoots her in the face. He goes inside the warehouse, picks up his ruby from the floor next to Dream's unconscious body, and heads with it to a 24-hour diner where he plans to sit and wait for the end of the world. Okay, Alisa. Wow. These two issues. And having read ahead at the 24-hour diner, whew, next week is going to be a discussion, but that is next week's problem. All right. So for these issues, what are the thoughts that you're having about these narratives?
I think that they stake out two very different territories of horror, and it's really interesting that they are, to me, vary very much in their feel. So the first one, A Hope in Hell, is a lot of the fun of lots of demons with eyes where their noses should be, and mouths, multiple mouths, and multiple arms, and it's a little like the Star Wars cantina scene in places. So there's trickery and fairy tale mythological fun. Then we get into Passengers, and suddenly the tone and the mood is more realistic and far creepier.
Yeah. No, it is. What happens in Passengers with John Dee is, and again, it's this. There's something like you can have horror where you've got jump scares and you've got, horrific things and blood and violence and all of that kind of stuff and that sort of fear thing going on. But again, when you combine it with that humanity, the humanity of Rosemary, the woman just driving him, through this town and being kind to him, and then seeing his complete inhumanity to her. Even though he had this like really kind of warm, sweet conversation with her as they, drove to this town. There is that mixture of the human within humane that just makes it so much more gripping and so much more interesting. And I love that about these stories. I mean, there's that human element in Passengers, which is the second issue, and then the first one where we're just kind of running through hell. And I really hope that this doesn't come off as an insult because it sounds really bad, but like everything in there is so ridiculous as all this rhyming. It felt sort of like Dr. Seussy to me, the ways in which these demons are drawn almost like the what are they, the snitches with the stars on their bellies,
Absolutely. I also had a note to myself that there was a Dr. Seuss aspect to this, and it's this sort of inventive, playful side. However, the rhyming demons is not a Neil thing. That was there are rhyming demons. See, if Josh Unruh was here, he would know the entire sourcing of this. I don't know if it was, I know Alan Grant did a lot with the demon Etrigan. I think I just looked this up for this. I think it was Matt Wagner had done an Etrigan miniseries, and Etrigan himself was originally a Jack Kirby character. But so I think what Neil is doing here is he is deliberately pulling on all these different strands of comic book lore and world mythology lore, and he's just having a ball. So one of the things that I noticed this time around, and I can't remember if I noticed it back in the early 90s, at the beginning of issue 5, the artwork looks really different. And there's a reason for that. That's because we're in the dream of Scott Free, also known as Mr. Miracle. And this is a character created by Jack Kirby. He was a writer and an artist and a wildly creative innovator. People have called him the William Blake of comics.
Yes.
So if you want to, you're going on a date with an artist who knows anything about comics, you drop, Jack Kirby references and you're in. So that more angular style, the difference of the color there, that is sort of a very meta commentary because we're in Scott Free's dream, and Scott Free was a character. He was, I think it was I had to look this up. By the way, one of my favorite collaborators, Alain Morissette, he is a huge Kirby fan, and he's always talking about Mr. Miracle and about Big Barda. I think he's got a crush on Big Barda. So Scott grew up in Granny Goodness's terror orphanage.
Oh,
and I had to look this up. I know Alain talks about this a lot. He's from Belgium. So I'm hearing Granny Goodness's, a terror orphanage in his accent. But anyway, so that's one of those moments where we are seeing how people's perceptions are affecting not just what we see, but the style in which we see it, the scrim through which we see it.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Yeah. It's funny. Jack Kirby is somebody that we've talked about a lot. Of course, I'm very familiar because of having worked on the Marvel Cinematic Universe podcast, Listen Up A-Holes, working again with Joshua Unruh, who is going to get shout outs, I think, all the time because of his incredible encyclopedic knowledge of everything comics. But I first learned actually about Jack Kirby years ago when I started listening to a band called Kirby Crackle, which is a geek band. They sing geek songs. But I wondered what Kirby Crackle was. And then when I started working with Joshua Unruh, I asked him about that. And he was like, oh yeah, it's the lightning crackle that comes from Jack Kirby's drawings. So and I can see that connection. And when I saw the Granny and the nightmare and all that stuff, at first I was like, okay, I don't understand what the hell's going on here. And Jack Kirby is just an absolute legend. So when Mr. Miracle, when this story started and we went into this and there was this grandmother and there was these horrifying things and these people hanging on spikes and everything, I figured it was a dream, because so much of this, I mean, obviously we're living within the landscape of dreams. We're talking within the language of dreams, which is really interesting. And I figured all of that had some kind of historical anchor within, the rest of the world building. So it's neat to see that connection.
It's one of two places that we really see how subjective Sandman's appearance is.
Yeah.
It's an interesting thing that it is being presented to us that we see Sandman with his bone white skin and his sort of 80s rocker hair. And he seems to never have a shirt under his coat. Maybe that's just me. Then he goes into hell and Etrigan, the rhyming demon, takes him past a place where some people are being held prisoner. And one of the people there is Nada. And we discover that she was a great love of his and that she's been imprisoned there. And we're beginning to get the feeling that may have something to do with Dream. So that is just cool enough, and that Etrigan's kind of messing with the Sandman's head. But all of a sudden we see this woman who is African. And then when we turn back to the Sandman, now he is African too.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting how we have all of these identities. And she calls him, I'm sure I'm butchering the pronunciation, but Kaikul, right? Which is such a neat another identity for him, And we have it's so incredibly evocative, and even knowing nothing about the history here. One page, right? We see never trust a demon, no matter what. If they have 100 motives, 99 at least are malevolent, right? Walks him past, where he has to walk on this ledge very, very close to the cells. She sees him and she's like, you've come to free me. I'm here because of you, because, he was mad at her. And then, she says, don't you love me? And he says, yes, I still love you, but I have not yet forgiven you. That's why she's there. She's there until he forgives her. And she sees him, like the cruelty of Etrigan on every level, cruelty to her, by making her see Dream, thinking that he is coming to release her, the cruelty of putting Dream in that position, and the, yes, I still love you, but I have not yet forgiven you. Like, I don't know what the hell is going on there. I don't even care. Like, there is enough in that. There's so much. And again, that narrative density in comics, and especially, I think, in these. I've read some other comics. These are the most, comics are narratively dense anyway, but these are some of the most narratively dense comics I think I have ever read. And I find it.
These would need us.
Yeah.
I was just going to say these would need that special mammogram for very dense stories.
For very dense stories, exactly. Absolutely. It's just so interesting. And I was wrecked by that page, knowing nothing about anything. I had no idea who Nada was before that page. And then I read that page and I was like, oh my God, this is terrifying. And then he just walks and leaves her there. And that's it. She's just still in hell, clearly suffering a great deal. And I don't know what she did that was so bad, but I really want to find out.
And you will. And you will.
Yay. I'm very excited.
It's really a very rewarding thing that nothing is thrown away.
Mm-hmm.
There are sometimes snippets of stories that we won't completely see fleshed out, but the major ones are, and even some of the minor ones before we finish this ride, we are really going to find out a lot of, there are wonderful side excursions, and then sometimes they become main excursions.
Oh God, it's so interesting. I'm really, really enjoying this. And the thing is that there's so many references to things like the Scott-free stuff. I had no idea. We spent 2 pages, I think, which is a lot of time for, comics like this, on his dream in Granny's, House of Horrors or whatever. And all of that felt like this, I didn't understand it. I didn't know the references. I didn't know where it was coming from. But still it brings in this kind of richness of the world. And it's one of those things that I think when you're reading comics, you kind of sign up for that. You sign up for, there's so much happening here and some of it is going to fly right over you. If you don't understand the context of it, just enjoy it in the moment and keep on trucking, because there's just so many things. I found that when we were going through the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Joshua Unruh would come in every week with 4-color facts and talk about all of the references in that, and all of the things that they were kind of Easter egging inside of all of these stories. And it was like, after a while, I was like, oh my God, and I find it really, really interesting kind of part of the genre is that the storytelling world itself is so incredibly broad. The universe in which you're working is so incredibly broad that you're just going to be pulling all of this stuff up, which is something that Neil does in general, like in all of his work. He pulls from existing places and spins up a story into gold. It's always so interesting. One of the things that I really responded to, and I mean the thing is, like, whenever you read fiction, which is part of the magic of fiction, right? The magic of fiction is that it is this magic mirror, and you look in it and you see yourself. You see yourself reflected through whatever the fiction is. So when you're looking at the fiction, you always see it through your own lens. And for me, what I keep seeing in all of this week after week as we keep talking about it is Dream's trauma and his experience of trauma. So the first page, of A Hope in Hell completely socks me in the gut. He's touching the sand. He's trying to reconnect with himself. And then it is time for me to walk the abyss, time to reclaim my own. And for me, having been through a pretty significant trauma through the last few years of my life, I look at that and that need to reconnect with yourself, to know who you are, and then reclaim. You have to go through your life and reclaim every little thing from that trauma, So I look at that page and I was just so struck by how beautifully it kind of expressed that feeling for me, And again, fiction is a magic mirror. Everybody sees it through their own lens. Somebody whose experience is something else may have seen something else in that. But for me, this story, he's going out, he's getting back the things that were lost, that is for me a trauma narrative. That was my experience. That was my trauma narrative about getting back the things that I had lost from it. And I just found that first page to be so incredibly powerful. I stared at it for such a long time and was just so struck by it and found it so incredibly powerful. And I love that part of this, time to reclaim my own. there's just something about that mission that I absolutely love for Dream.
Absolutely. For me, I also notice how much this storytelling is grounded in someone's personal journey.
Yeah.
And one thing that I thought might be good to point out is how captions are being used here.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know enough about comics history to say if it's the first or the
Yeah.
second or what usage it is. But when I was a kid, captions were used in a much more utilitarian way. It was sort of, now kids, the Batman is hiding here, and so sometimes you'd get literary and poetic moments, but they tended to be a little more remote. And often you'd get, with Stan Lee, you'd get those little asterisky footnotey asides. But this is real first person storytelling.
Yeah.
So a lot of these captions are getting us into Dream's experience. And I think that more personal form of storytelling, it's part of a departure. You notice there are also no thought balloons. I think thought balloons fell far out of favor around this time. I think they might even be coming back a little bit. But so the captions are giving us a chance to peer into Dream's head.
Well, yeah, it's a first person narration versus like a third person omniscient, third person removed, right? Which is what you might have gotten in captions, prior to this. So yeah, I loved the way that narration was. I loved how personal it was. It was really, really good. One of the things too that I noticed, when of course he's descending through hell, to get to Lucifer so that they can have a chat, and there's this world building done with the Wood of Suicides, right? So the Wood of Suicides, I had presumed, stems from this idea that some religions will prescribe to. That is, if somebody commits suicide, they go to hell. Right. And so you see these trees, these leafless trees reliving the end of their life and why they did it and why they made that choice. And the thing that I found so interesting about this as a piece of world building is that Dream walks through and he says it used to be a wood and now it is a forest. Which makes me think that this again is the footprint of Roderick Burgess's greed and evil, that by taking Dream away, more people were in enough pain that they then, committed suicide. And what a beautiful moment of world building that is as he is wandering through, hell. It's a terrible thing to have to read and see. It's so powerful. And this was, again, another one of those moments that just hit me dead in the face.
I think that the Wood of Suicides may be part of Dante's Inferno. I think that may be part of that geography of hell. I'm suspecting that it is, but it is very like Neil to then also fit it in and connect it up with the mythology that he's creating here with Roderick Burgess and Dream's capture. And I also think there's something so poignant about these very human trees. Yeah. And, I can see it as a story in its own right. Yeah. This is so much of what I love about Neil's storytelling, that he leaves so many nooks and crannies where stories can collect.
Yeah, God, it's such a wonderful piece of world building, and so striking and so sad, and you see these, all the demons seem to be having a big party, but the human souls that are in hell, we see that in Nada, we see that in the Wood of Suicides. Again, it's when you bring humanity into this horror that it's like blooming, yeast for rising bread, right? It just blooms, and then you've got something you can work with, something really, really rich, and I love that. Okay, we got to talk about Lucifer a little bit. Lucifer looks like David Bowie to me. I'm assuming that was intended. That was the original intent, that it was supposed to be a David Bowie. You know, we had Sting supposedly inspiring the look for Constantine. And now we have David Bowie as Lucifer. And Lucifer appears to like really super hate Dream. So I'm guessing there's some kind of bad blood in the history there.
I first with Bowie, I think that the original idea is that the description, it ties in with, I believe, what are some Kabbalistic descriptions of angels as being neither male nor female in some respects, that they're sort of androgynous. And so it's going into that sphere of androgyny. Pretty sure about that. As for the bad blood, I don't remember if there was a specific beef between them from before.
Yeah.
But I got the feeling that there is a lot of political maneuvering. There is a lot of this sense that the Sandman is coming as a head of state in his own right, but he has lost power. They kind of disapprove of each other. You can tell that the Sandman is just appalled that Lucifer would agree to a power share.
Yeah.
And so I got some of that feeling of
a political maneuvering,
strained diplomacy.
Biden and Putin.
Yes, or maybe even Boris Johnson.
Maybe. Well, I think it's going to be wonderful. As I was reading this, I was imagining Gwendolyn Christie playing this role in the Netflix series, and I have to say, was so excited for what she's going to bring to that. So I kind of loved that history between them, that kind of chess playing, you know, what's going on there. And then the rules of hell. You know, we've got the rules, we've got a hierarchy, we've got all of these things going on. You know, they have to battle because whoever the demon was who got the helm got it fair. You know, I find that really, really interesting. But moving into Passengers from Hope and Hell, at the end of Hope and Hell, we have this little coda where John Dee receives this eyeball from his mother, which, you know, okay, sure. And then we move into this Passengers story where we have Dream being a passenger in people's dreams, getting to where he needs to go. And John Dee, in a much more mundane sort of circumstance, getting a gun, you know, killing some guards, and running off and escaping out of Arkham Asylum. But before we get to that, I was a little confused, and I don't know, maybe there's something I missed or something. In the opening, we see the body of a guard on the floor, and then we see him talking to a hanged man. Right? Who says, you know, I'm just joking. I'll have my tongue hanging out of my mouth and all this, but it's just a joke. And so to me, it feels like somebody really is hanging there and John Dee is just hallucinating or having some kind of psychotic break in that moment. But I didn't understand, like, did he hang that guy? Was that also a suicide? Why did he hang him? If he's got the gun, he's just shooting the others. Did I miss something in that early part of this?
I don't think you did. Okay. I read it as John Dee is insane, and in his insanity, he is seeing some things that are true without being real.
Without being literal.
And so without being literally real. So he sees this hanged man, and the hanged man then transforms into the supervillain, the arch villain, the Scarecrow.
Oh, okay.
And the Scarecrow says, and in the art, you can see that he is this slender, bespectacled guy. Looks a little like Lucien, but you can see a sort of an image of a scarecrow behind him. I've just made a very evocative gesture, everyone, which is going to be so helpful to you. And he says something which it feels sort of a little insane as well. They're all insane there. But there's also, it's you know, this great line about you're going to, you know, John Dee is off to destroy and rule the world. And the Scarecrow, who probably only exists in Dee's head, says, "Oh, you're coming back. Everyone's going to come back. The outside is so scary."
Mm-hmm. It's really, really interesting. I hadn't made the connection that there was a scarecrow behind him, and I'm not familiar with that villain. So that's really interesting. But then we move into John Dee runs outside, buck naked, finds this woman who's just driving, puts the gun in her face, says, "You're going to take me out to get my ruby." And in the first moment, she's like, "Oh, my husband, he's in the mafia. He'll kill you." And then John's vulnerability with her. And this is the thing. Vulnerability is the absolute, the major quality in a character. Vulnerability is the thing that allows us as humans to connect to each other. And it allows her to connect with him. He is naked. He is alone. He is cold. "Take my husband's coat. It's in the back seat, so you don't have to be cold. And let me just drive you, And they get talking, and she asks him, about himself, and he talks, and they have this, this really kind of warm human connection as we cut back and forth with Dream, who's going to see Scott free and who's trying to find the information, who finally realizes or gets the information that this ruby is in a warehouse in Mayhew, and so they're both headed to the same place. John Dee gets there, steps out of the car, and says, "Was that true about your husband being in the mafia?" And she's like, "No, he's a high school teacher. I just said that because I was afraid." And then he says, "I guess it doesn't matter anyway," and just shoots her in the face. I mean, it is so chilling and like wonderful and evocative and horrible, horrible in horror. And again, when you have the inhuman mixed with the human, that is when horror, I think, works at its best, And I found this, like, all the hounds of hell and the fighting and the rap battle, between the envisioned rap battle between the demon
Choronson and Dream.
Choronson, right, and Dream in hell to get the helm. All of that was one thing, but it wasn't as chilling and scary as this one moment, and how beautifully that was drawn, where you just see the barrel of the gun and the blood spatter coming back. God, beautifully done. Horrible, but not in a bad way. You know what I'm saying? Like
it belongs to, if you look up horror, they'll talk, there's horror comedy, and there's monster horror, and there's murderer horror, and there's
body horror, and
redneck horror with banjos and pigs.
Right.
So there are all of these different kinds, but for me, there really are two kinds of horror that are the main categories, the way I think of it when I'm looking for a book. One kind of horror, there is one person left at the end, what I think, they call the final girl, but it's not always a girl. There is somebody who is pure enough of heart that they come out to rebuild on the ashes of what was.
Yeah.
And then there's the kind of horror where no one gets out unscathed. There, you think that perhaps that the person has gotten out, and then they turn toward the camera and you see a glint in their eye and you're like, "Oh no, you too are a pod person." And you realize that everything has now gone to hell. So that it's really interesting to me that you've got that moment, which is the good, the compassionate, there is nothing you can do and no way that you can be that will save you. Horror is contained within this arc in which we've just seen Dream in hell, and he won his battle with the word hope. What is so powerful that all the demons in hell cannot, rise up against it, because they would lose all their power. If people didn't have hope,
right, then
they would also not have despair.
What use is hell if the people there have no hope, right?
Yes, and have no other, so it's this idea that it is our great strength. It is a kind of weakness. in the sense that I guess, as you're holding on to hope, well, is it a weakness as well? I mean, it is. It is the idea that we live by the contrast.
It's a vulnerability.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a vulnerability, right? Vulnerabilities are the things that can hurt you. And the thing that you hope for, Nada, as she sits in that cell, is hoping for Dream to come and release her. And in the moment, she sees what she's hoping for pass by her and keep walking, that is, the devastating part of hope, that moment when the light goes out, when the hope is gone. But at the same time, hope has the power to sustain us through everything, through anything. Hope is the thing that gets you through. And it is only when, you succumb to despair that everything gets dark. Hope is the light. And so I find that I loved that moment, with Dream, where he's like, he's playing down that final card and he's like, I am hope. And then Choronzon or Chorizo says, he can't do anything. He's just completely stumbling and has nothing, cannot think of anything that beats hope. And I found that to be like a really incredibly powerful moment in a story that was, again, it was all these demons. It was all this kind of, hyperbole of hell sort of thing, and then we have this moment where just the one thing that shuts all of that, that kind of chittery, hellish nonsense down is hope. I mean, that's the power.
Yes, and it's a place where it's clever because that's what's winning the contest, but it's also more than just clever.
Yeah.
I have to say one thing. So there's so much glorious artwork in this and expressive artwork, the ingenuity of all the demons and the architecture of hell. I do have one slight dissatisfaction, I guess I would say, in that I think that Nada is supposed to be a really beautiful woman. I know that she's been imprisoned for 10,000 years. I look like crap after just one sleepless night, but I don't know that the artwork completely conveys how beautiful she is, how tormented she is. Yes. But that's a small note.
Yeah. Yeah. Also, I don't know. I think that the reliance of a woman's value being expressed in her beauty and in visual media, we do that so much. So the idea that, we see her and she's, she's not, hideous. She's just not that kind of boobs up to her chin, sort of, clad in leather, typical kind of feminine beauty that we see kind of illustrated. She is not a beauty in this made for the male gaze. So I actually kind of liked that because Dream, this amazing, loved her, and the idea that you don't have to be this unbelievable classic conventional beauty in order to be worthy of love, To me, I kind of appreciate that a little bit, but I get it. Because, canonically, she is this great beauty and she wasn't necessarily drawn, to represent that kind of beauty. But also that he would always see her as beautiful. We're seeing him through her eyes, and she is using the name that she had for him. That he sees her, maybe that way. Maybe I woke up literally woke up like this, not the fake I woke up like this, but just, it's been a long time, 10,000 years in hell. It'll take it out of you. So yeah, but the artwork, absolutely, I think is just incredible. And one of my favorite pages too, is the one where Dream, he's in the warehouse, he finds the ruby. And we just heard in Dee's, scene how corrupted the ruby was, from everything that he had done to it over the years. And then he just crumbles to the ground, falls down in the red light of the ruby. It is so corrupted that it brings him down. And I think that it shows how powerful D is. And that's one of the things that you always want to do. Like here we have an Endless, right? It's a pretty powerful dude. He was able to beat the other guys who captured him by just waiting him out. Like he has all the time in the world, like literally. And here we have John D, who is a person who struggles with his mental state, and is clearly, got a lot of evil, kind of going on in there and a lot of things happening. But he's human. And so you look at, here we have Dream, an Endless, who just, went to hell on a typical Wednesday and got his helm back and, battled the demons of hell and got his helm back and then travels through dreams. Like he is incredibly powerful. So to illustrate how powerful D is, because he actually managed to booby trap an Endless, that's kind of neat. That's kind of a neat matchup. It gives us it makes the power differential so much less than what you would expect. You would expect Dream to be able to swat D away like a fly, and that's not the case.
Yes, and I don't know that we are meant to think that D did it on purpose. Mm-hmm. He was just trying to tamper and make the. Yes, he was making the ruby his own. Mm-hmm. And so it is something that the Sandman can no longer just incorporate back into himself.
Right. But I mean, that's whether he meant to do it to Dream or not. Like that's an incredible power. And that evens out the kind of power differential that you would expect between these two adversaries,
Which is a really important thing to do. You don't want to pit your very powerful hero against someone who's just toothless, naked, and not very together.
Right, exactly.
Which is also what John D is.
He is. He is very complex. He has a lot of things, which I think is very, very cool.
And he's never gotten his own action figure. I'm pretty sure of this.
Oh my goodness. I don't even know how you would do it. All right. So before we go into Lucien's library, I just wanted to pull out a few of my favorite lines here. I love this. Never trust a demon from page 111 in the Kindle version. Never trust a demon. He has 100 motives for anything he does. 99 of them at least are malevolent. I read that and I was like, that's beautifully expressed. And this is right on the page where he's being traipsed past Nada, and then, just, I am hope. How powerful is that? I am hope. I thought that was so great.
Yeah, no, those are wonderful. Mm-hmm. I love the contest between the magicians. Mm-hmm. So I loved there are many ways to lose the oldest game. Mm-hmm. Failure of nerve, hesitation, being unable to shift into a defensive shape, lack of imagination. Mm-hmm. And I thought how that feels like in any negotiation,
right?
In any high stakes negotiation, these are all the ways that you can lose. Yeah. I loved the scarecrow or the scarecrow in John D's mind saying, yes, but we always come back here. It's so scary outside. And it's because we know that no matter how many times the Joker and the Riddler and all of these guys get out of Arkham Asylum, somehow they always get put back in. So I loved it as sort of them as dealing with their craziness, which keeps bringing them back to the same place, which feels kind of relatable to me. And of course, trust me, I'm a doctor.
That's a classic line.
I think that might be, what goes with the action figure of John D.
Oh my God, seriously. Now I want that action figure. Well, no, I don't, but I do. But I don't. All right, so now we're going to move into Lucien's library. Warning to everybody, this may include spoilers. We're going to be going a little bit behind the scenes and kind of talking outside of the text of the stories that we're reading today. So one of the things that you had in your notes for Lucien's library is talking about the world mythology. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Well, so first of all, I want to take us back. This was, the Sandman was still going on. But at this point, I was working on the spin-off for that became The Dreaming. And that was a spin-off series. And I went to Neil's house, and it was late at night. We were in his office, which I remember being on a lower level. And his daughter, Holly, came in, the same daughter that a few years earlier I'd heard the bedtime stories with. And she asked him, and he said, "Not now, darling. Daddy's working." And she said something like, "Well, I don't see what it is that you do that's such a big deal. All you do is take other people's ideas and steal them in your stories." And she storms off.
Oh my
and there's
God.
a beat. And then with perfect timing, Neil turns to me and says, "She's absolutely right."
Oh my God.
But the truth behind that for me is that he has read so much world mythology and he's digested it. For all of us, we can find stories that we want to riff on in our own writing. We want to retell King Lear or whatever it is, but it really helps if you've done a deep dive and you've digested the material enough. So, it comes across as your own. And so in that battle, the battle of transformation between Choronson and Sandman, I know that that's from Puss in Boots, where Puss in Boots, battles the ogre. But there's also, I think there's one in the Arabian Nights where an Ifrit and the king's daughter battle. There's instances in Finnish mythology and lots of other mythologies. Actually, Steel Eye Span, when I was a little girl, the medieval rock was a thing in the 70s. And so Steel Eye Span was an English band that had a song called Two Magicians. And it's all about this woman trying to get away from this guy. And, she'll turn into a corpse and he turns into an undertaker. Anyway, so it's got a fine, long tradition to it. But I love the fact that Neil made it fresh and modern by, it's not just in hell, but he gives it the Mrs. Maisel treatment 30 years before that show was an idea. And there's this whole borscht belt aspect of it. So I think that as the series progresses, Neil goes more and more into these wonderful folk world mythology tales, and those are some of there are longer story arcs, and they are interspersed with these sometimes single issue short stories, and I love those. And years later, of course, Neil was given a chance to write a book about world mythology, a Norton mythology book, and he asked me if I would help him as a sort of research assistant come book doula. And in the end, we ended up narrowing in on just one mythology, and that became the Book of Norse Mythology.
Oh, so cool. Oh my God. Yeah. Neil pulls through the ground, it kind of is like a superpower, where all of these things in mythology, these stories that we as humans have been telling, for millennia, are so deeply charged with the human experience, the human experience expressed through metaphor, and magic, so that we can step back from it and take a look at it, kind of boil down to its essence. And Neil's ability to pull that essence kind of through the ground and form something with it. It's like those people who make cows out of butter. It's fascinating to see him kind of sculpt these stories. What?
People make cows out of butter?
There are butter sculptures. People do butter sculptures, and they do like cows, and they do, like kind of like wax figures. I would bet that somewhere someone has sculpted Neil Gaiman out of butter. I would guess that's probably happened. Anyway, it's a whole thing. But the point is, Neil has the ability to do that. And he does that in his stories where he'll kind of pull from this material. And I am not at all surprised to discover that he is extremely well versed in all of these different mythologies, because you do see these resonances coming up in his stories all the time, which is part of what makes them so much fun, so it's a part, I think, of what makes Neil really, really magical. And I recently have been watching his master class on storytelling, because what I teach is craft. What I teach is, here's your protagonist, here's how protagonists work, here's your structure, here's how structure works, here's all of this stuff, narrative, how to build character, all of that kind of stuff. That's the craft. That's the stuff you can put your back against. But the thing is that the craft is just allows you to build a stage for your magic to dance upon, right? And when I think about the person who best exemplifies the power of magic in storytelling, it's Neil Gaiman. He's the one that I think of. He's the one that I talk to my students about when I'm like, I can't teach you magic. Nobody can teach you magic. Magic is just magic. You have to discover what your particular magic is itself. The stuff that I teach, the craft, that's universal storytelling, blah, 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 blah. But your magic is going to come from somewhere. Neil's magic comes from these resonances of human experience throughout the millennia that he's pulling through, which I find so wonderful and engaging about his work. But anyway, so anybody who wants to learn the magic side of things, learn by reading Neil Gaiman. He is probably one of the best examples that I use when I'm trying to explain magic to people. I go to Neil Gaiman. He's like the number one example of that. And I think his masterclass on storytelling really talks about kind of how to access your magic, how to figure out your magic, which I really, really love. I go back to it all the time because magic is the hard part. You can learn the craft, you can get your back up against all that stuff, but magic is the hard part, and accessing where yours comes from takes a while to figure that out. But back to this, one of the things that they talk about is the Hell's hierarchy, right? We come back, we've got, Lucifer, who was in charge, and now he's got a couple of senior vice presidents, I guess, on either side. He has to rule and dole out territory and whatever it is that's going on. Can you talk a little bit about hell and the world building of hell and what's going on there with that hierarchy?
So I came on after this storyline, and I was there when we returned to hell in Season of Mists. And I remember these editorial meetings where we would be talking about the geography and hierarchy of hell, because we had Hellblazer, written by Jamie Delano, going on at the same time as we had Sandman. And then we also had Garth Ennis's Preacher. And they all had these different senses of hell and who was ruling hell. And I remember, I think Karen Berger had a wonderfully live and let live feeling about the book. She did not want to enforce there is one version of hell and this is how it has to be, and it has to be consistent from Vertigo and from all of the DC titles, which may have not lent itself to a vasty, to use the word that they keep using in these issues, a vasty movie empire as well. But it was really good for writers' creativity. But I do remember people trying to do a little bit of reconciliation. So I am guessing that some of this whole hell hierarchy stuff probably had something to do with stuff that was going on in other comics like Hellblazer. And, but I just, it really was incredibly amusing to me. I had these moments where I was in the editorial meetings. I was thinking, I cannot believe that my, little bit of I went to a Jewish school where I was studying the Bible in Hebrew, and we would, discuss little excursions into mythology. And so I loved that we were going on these trippy talks about, well, okay, so if it's Lucifer in this book, but it's Beelzebub in that book, and that's okay because there's sort of different divisions of hell. So yes, that's the hierarchy of hell.
I find that so interesting. But here's a question that I have for you, and I don't know if you have the answer at all, but I found this really interesting. On page 114, again, I'm reading the Kindle version. Lucifer says, some years ago, the dark, the shadow shadow creature, came forth to challenge heaven. This episode ended in perhaps a stalemate, but the civil war in hell that ensued tipped the precarious balance of power. And honestly, the first thing this makes me think of is Good Omens, which Neil was writing at the same time with Terry Pratchett. And Good Omens, of course, I did a podcast on the book and the TV show of that. It's Welcome to the End Times for anybody who wants to go and listen to it. So one thing that I remembered from Good Omens, not to spoil any of that amazing story, is that we kind of do have things sort of ending in a stalemate. We have this big apocalypse that's supposed to happen, and there's the forces of heaven and the forces of hell, and they're all battling each other on Earth. And I found it really interesting because I'm like, is this, are we including the Good Omens version? Beelzebub was in Good Omens as well. And I think we had some of these same characters. I believe we had Azazel in Good Omens, although don't quote me on that, 'cause I'm not sure. But there's a lot of demons, floating around, a lot of demons causing all sorts of trouble. And it's funny because I was like, well, he was working on Good Omens at about the same time. It came out in 1990. So I'm curious if there was any kind of like a bleed over from those two worlds.
I doubt it. I mean, I think that the idea of politics in hell is a fairly classic one. A lot of the demon names are names from demonology. So Azazel, I think, is the goat that gets sent into the wilderness with the sins of the people.
Yeah.
And there's a goat for Azazel. And why, and goats actually, if you ever look at a goat, they've got those weird eyes with the horizontal pupils. And having been attacked by a goat myself, I do think they're devilish. And the other thing that I think is sort of, the whole, I speak Hebrew, but, often the way we say these words in English is so different. So Beelzebub, it took me years. And I suddenly thought, wait a minute, that's probably Baal Zvuv, which means Lord of the Flies.
Oh,
I don't know why.
Interesting.
But because we said, anyway, this is a stupid thing. But a lot of these names these are... Later in life, I kind of got more interested in looking up all of the demonology and some of the lore, and I feel I've gone down an incredible rabbit hole here. But yes, I'm pretty sure that may be a reference to some other comics event. I think Neil was pretty good at
keeping
sort of
it all
being aware of what was going on in the other books.
But we have the stalemate in Good Omens. So it sounds like kind of a summary of what happened in Good Omens. So I was like, I wonder if that's kind of a maybe an Easter egg or something. I'll read it that way. It probably wasn't, but I'll read it that way. I think it's pretty cool. All right. So also we wanted to have a little bit of discussion of the covers, Dave McKean's covers that he did for these.
Yeah, Dave was such an important, integral part of Sandman's look, of its success. So one of the things I'll say is I think that when you walk, especially in the late 80s, early 90s, you would walk into a store and you would look at a cover, and that is what would tempt you to open up a book. And comic book covers tended to have a look. They had recognizably, usually if it was a Batman book, you had Batman on the cover. And if it was Wonder Woman, you had Wonder Woman. And there was a fight scene. And all of a sudden, you've got these Sandman covers, and they didn't look like anything else. I still remember that first moment when I was handed some Sandman comics, and I was thinking, this looks like surrealist art. It doesn't look at all like what I was expecting. I later found out from Karen that, that Dave and Neil approached together, and when they were young, little 20-somethings, and they worked together on I think it was Violent Cases, and as I mentioned in the last podcast, Black Orchid. And so Dave was doing the interior art for that. I started to dig around and see a little bit more about, I found somewhere a picture with a friend's help, actually, who's an artist, a picture of the actual mock-up of the cover for Sandman 1. And it is done as a a combination of, I guess, a collage and a painting. So you've got that painting with combination of pencil maybe and paint of that mysterious Sandman figure. And then you've got these shadow boxes or shelves on either side, and there are little objects in each of those. And I think all of those objects are linked with elements of the story. And Dave is good at not just evoking a feel and a sensibility, but really tying in the themes and words as Neil is. So you've got, and there's a Lucifer cover, and you see all this writing, and there's bits of, I believe it's Paradise Lost in there with this sort of scarlet. And I found an interview with Dave in which he said some interesting things about the covers at the time. By issue 8, this was from an interview. Where did I find this interview? Oh God, I'll find it later. But by issue 8, Sandman was already becoming a little strange, as much about ideas as an adventure story. So I thought the covers should represent that. Since the interior artists changed all the time, I was the only consistent visual element. And that hadn't happened yet at this point. We're still with Sam Keith and Dringenberg. But I wanted the covers to be a filter, a window of slightly surreal, melancholy, thoughtful imagery to pass through. And he says that for the first issue, all pre-computers, he was wandering around London and finding interesting bits and bobs to use as imagery. He says, we liberated a fantastic looking broken door from a skip. That's what do you call it?
Dumpster, right? Yeah.
Dumpster. Thank you. Brain went fritz. And so we found odds and ends in antique shops. People started donating things. I did a signing in London, and someone gave me a lamb's heart in a block of resin. It got used a few times. And he talks about the different methods of double exposures, triple exposures, using old color photocopiers. So I think it's really fascinating to see what he was doing. And there are now collections of the covers he did for Sandman.
Yeah.
So I think at some point, maybe we should, maybe with the next issue, I'll start to talk about the cover a bit specifically, as well as the interior art, because I think it's interesting to look at how you can see a reflection of all of those themes. And with the first 5 covers that we've got, we start with the Sandman. I think was the second one the 3 Witches.
I don't know. I don't think they're in the Kindle version. So I really need to find these and take a look at them.
So I'll have to,
because the ones that I have are just yellow. It's just kind of like all yellow. It's not sort of background,
which is really a shame to miss out on those. But I believe it is the first one's the Sandman, the second the 3 Witches, the third is John Constantine, and then Lucifer, and then the last one is Mr. Miracle, I believe, and there's these bits of circuitry. Ooh. So maybe it's Mr. Miracle, or maybe it's John Dee himself, that little bits of circuitry and the way he's used the ruby. Now I'm realizing I don't know. Ooh, but they're all incredibly evocative. They've got these different elements of collage as well as painting. So
I love it. I love it. All right. So now that we're talking about the art, what's your favorite page?
What is my favorite page? I had a lot that I really loved here. I think actually I've looked at the script, and I know you picked one of mine, so I'm going to pick my runners up. I love the fact that as John Dee and Rosemary drive past a movie theater, the film showing is Night of the Living Dead with a co-hit, Zombie Woof.
I love it.
And I have no idea if that's an in-joke or an obscure reference, but I love that it's just this little element there. And I also love the panel. There's a little throwaway kindness to John, the last Martian. If you wish, you may dream of the city of vocative mirrors.
That is really nice. And it kind of feels like a reference to Rachel, right? That he had kind of given her something nice in her dreams. And so now it's kind of sort of his calling card, Like, well, you've pleased me today, so you may have a nice dream. which I really, really love. I have to say,
What about you?
Yeah, for me, it was really, really hard for me to pick like a favorite page. And the winner for me is the first page in A Hope in Hell, where he's sitting there and his hands are going through the sand and he's trying to reconnect. I think it's a wonderful moment in the story itself, but I also think that it's an incredible, kind of evocative trauma experience, which I really, really love. Time to reclaim my own. And I love the way it looks. I love what it is in the story and the narrative. And I love visually the way it's expressed on that page. For my favorite part, I think what I stole from you is I am hope, right? That moment, the unbeatability of hope. That hope is the absolute please pardon the expression, trump card for everything. It's all about hope.
I don't think we can say that anymore.
Yeah, I think you can.
We'll have to come up
we
with
have to come up with
another
phrase for that, because it's just a word that I don't ever want to say ever again. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff. I think that there's so much. I loved the page where John Dee is saying goodbye to Rosemary, and then shoots her in the face. Horrifying, but so beautifully drawn. I love traveling through all the people's dreams to get to the ruby. And then, of course, through your dreams, my sleeping children, you had a passenger and you never knew. I love when he's sitting at the front of the bus next to a bus driver who has a pumpkin for a head. All of it. It's just so cool. Oh, is there something behind that?
That's Merv Pumpkinhead.
I don't know Merv Pumpkinhead. Oh my God.
You will.
I'm so excited about that.
But I also I need to call out, the coolness of the art, because I called out my favorite story parts, but I have just my hat off to that wonderful double page spread of all the demons. When I think about going there, it's one thing as a writer to say, give me demons. Some of them have 3 breasts, some of them have 4 heads, some of them are kind of smiling at the camera, but the artists had to spend hours and hours to really create that, it's like a Cecil B. DeMille, 10 Commandments hell moment. And it's just, I am there for it. It is really cool. I also love the nightclub scene. There's actually, all of this crammed in stuff in the nightclub scene, including one really goofy kind of demon that's kind of waving at the camera.
Oh my God.
As if it's being filmed. And I love those lighter moments.
Oh my God,
too.
Dreams Fedora. My God,
Yes.
It's so like the jazzy nightclub kind of beat poet sort of, setting. God, there's so much in this. I have never struggled so much to pick favorite parts. I always have favorite part at the end of everything. Yeah.
Sandman as a beat poet is just, now I'm seeing that, and I
love it so much. All right, if you enjoyed this conversation, would like to join in, connect with the show on Twitter, follow @Chipperish and use the hashtag #EndlessPodcast, or send your comments or questions to endless@chipperish.com. Guys, we have an editor of Sandman on the show. Ask your questions, send them in, email us.
This episode of Endless was brought to you by the Chipperish Media producers who support us on Patreon at the power producer level. These people are the reason why Endless is coming to you free and ad-free right now. So thank you to Abby, Alice, Christina, Erica, Jonathan, Kevin, Kristen, Michael, Rose, Sarah, Shelley, Stephania, and Stephanie. And this week's special message for our power producers: let us hit the kitchen. I have a secret stash of Oreos of which you are welcome to partake.
I love that line. To find out how you too can support Chipperish Media, visit patreon.com/Chipperish. Other ways to show your support: write a great review on Apple Podcasts, tell your friends about the show, and never trust a demon.
We will be back next time with Volume 1, Preludes and Nocturnes, Issues 6 and 7, 24 Hours, and Sound and Fury. Until then, what power would hell have if those imprisoned here were not able to dream of heaven?